What's going on, everybody? It's Rod with Pow Group. Welcome back on The Pursuit of Wealth, your home for MJ stocks, crypto assets, news, and interviews. It is Friday. Happy Friday, May 2nd. Hope you're doing awesome. And in this video, we're going to be discussing SNDL and the potential delisting of its shares on the NASDAQ. We covered this in the last video, and I had a ton of people asking me what happens to my shares if I'm holding it on the NASDAQ or on Robinhood, for example, as an exchange. What happens to my shares if they actually do go through with the delisting process? And again, this is still very premature. They said it's just a strategic review, so there's no guarantee. We shouldn't take anything from it. It should all be taken with a grain of salt for now. It's still very preliminary at this point. They're just exploring and reviewing it and essentially, trying to determine what's the best path forward because of the US taking so long to see reform. They're thinking about maybe delisting, right? And then that way they can enter the US market. So there's going to be a trade-off for sure, but we'll discuss all of this and more in today's video and how it would affect you if it does come to fruition. Before we do, though, make sure to smash the like. If you're new, you can subscribe, take the bell. You'll be notified on any future videos or when I go live. And you can also follow us over on X, formerly Twitter. Handle for that is @GroupPow. Going to be using that as my platform of choice going forward. So this was the article from May 1st yesterday. They reported their first quarter 2025 financial results. And if we scroll down, and I made a video on this, but I wanted to do a separate video because apparently it wasn't clear enough and a lot of people were still asking questions. What happens to my shares if they do delist? But again, I don't think we need to worry about it too much right now. It's not set in stone, so we just take it as it comes, right? But finally, our board of directors has initiated a formal strategic review to evaluate SNDL's exposure to U.S. multi-state licensed MJ enterprises and its current exchange listing status as outlined later in this document. So effectively, they would be like a multi-state operator. They would just not be allowed. They would just not be allowed to uplist to the NYSE or the NASDAQ, and they would have to trade on the CSE, which they did just apply for the CSE, and that was effective April 11th, 2025. That's just the Canadian Securities Exchange, and they could follow in the footsteps of a TerraSend and a Cureleaf, where they get listed on the TSX, and then they would potentially trade on the OTC like you would see with these names in the US, these MSOs, right? They trade like TCNNF, also trades on Canadian Exchange under True, right? So there would be a similar setup, but one downfall of that is that institutional investors may be required to sell their holdings of delisted stocks, further depressing the price of the stock and making it harder to sell your shares. At the end of the day, there's a bunch of different ways that it could play out. We'll just have to wait and see, and we'll take a look at the chart here in just a moment. But if it does get delisted from the NASDAQ, you'd more than likely see it move to the OTC market, and you'd be given lots of heads up, more than likely, right? At least a few months, I would think, so you can get your ducks in a row. Like I said, reach out to your tax advisor. Again, this is not financial advice. I'm not telling you what to do, not telling you to buy, sell, or hold. This is for entertainment purposes only. What you want to do is actually reach out to your accountant, your financial advisor, your tax professional, and see what makes sense if this does end up happening. But again, it's just very, very early at this point. We don't know for sure, but it's something we should all definitely consider if being impacted by it. So your value may decline, but trading, as I mentioned, trading could become difficult, especially on a platform like Robinhood. They don't support OTC, so over-the-counter stocks. So essentially, you would still own the shares, but unless the company goes bankrupt, but you may have to transfer them to a different brokerage to sell. So if you're on Robinhood, you'd have a few different ways you can transfer the shares out of Robinhood to a different brokerage, or you might be forced to sell and then buy it on a different, there's a few different ways, but again, that could trigger a taxable event. So you want to consult with your financial advisor. Everybody's situation is going to be different, right? And then, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. More than likely, it's going to transfer to an OTC. They'll probably get listed on the TSX. They already have a listing on the CSE. So it'd effectively just be trading like a multi-state operator at that point. So we'll monitor the situation and we'll see what happens. But names like Robinhood, right? They focus more on US listed stocks and the major exchanges and ETFs, etc. But if we take a look at the hourly time frame here, we do have a descending triangle potentially forming, and it could bring us back down to the lows there at 126. We also had a bear flag target of 125. And if we lose 125, probably heading back down to around $1, but it's entirely possible that this weakness continues on the chart unless we see some sort of news pertaining to the company or the sector that lifts us up. But status quo, all things unchanged, I think we could potentially be trending back down to around that 125, maybe even down to $1 area, as we failed to close over the 10-week moving average this week, and we're still yet to see a MACD bull cross, but that could happen over the next couple weeks. Again, if we do dip down to around 125, $1, I think we should see a pretty big rebound after that. And then one thing I'm looking at here is the 50 and the 100 weekly moving average. We could see those cross bearish. We'll see if bulls can defend that. If that were to happen, would not be a great sign at all, and we'd more than likely be back down to that dollar area. We also just had a death cross on the SNDL daily time frame, and that was when the 50-day was above the 200-day, and they cross. That's considered a death cross. Here they cross bullish, and we had decent amount of upside. But the whole sector continues to remain weak, and there's been some developments with regards to U.S. reform. But it's going to be a while, right? If we're more than likely going to get banking rescheduling, and then they'll attempt to deschedule it, and we'll get maybe the States Act where they deschedule it in the states that have legalized it, right? If it's legal for medical, they deschedule it for the medical or recreational, depending on the state, right? So we'll see what happens. Ultimately, it doesn't sound like SNDL is very confident that there's going to be any major reform in the U.S. anytime soon, or they wouldn't be implementing the strategic review of their listing status. And he even said on the call that he wasn't very hopeful of anything in the near term. And listening to the CEO Zach George and the CFO Alberto, they didn't seem like they had a whole lot of excitement in their voice. So it seems like they're I'll just say that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like there's going to be anything, like we're probably not going to see uplisting to the NYSE and the NASDAQ for these companies in the U.S., which would kind of give, the Canadian operators the green light to do business in the U.S. more than likely. We'll have to wait and see. As long as it's federally illegal, it's hard to say that they'd be able to do that. But we'll see if we get some sort of safe harbor with regards to uplisting to the NYSE and the NASDAQ. I still think that safe banking is the most likely scenario. And then we get rescheduling and then eventually descheduling, or they leave it up to the states. We'll have to wait and see what happens. But pretty incredible to think that after almost 7 years here in Canada, we've been legalized at the federal level recreationally, and it's almost 7 years in, and the U.S. still has no real reform or pathway. Each individual state, we've seen, there's 24 states that have legalized it recreationally, and I think like close to 40, I think it was 38 last time I checked, in terms of medical. So we are seeing progress. It's turtle speed, right? And I've said for a while now that the U.S. is never first, but they're never last, and they don't have to be first either. They definitely don't want to be last, but they don't have to be first because they have the biggest economy in the world. They have the biggest capital markets in the world. So when they decide to do something, they could leapfrog every other country, like even Canada, right? If it's 10 years by the time they legalize it federally in the U.S., well, in Canada has been legal for 10 years. Like they could easily pass us in just a few years because of the sheer impact of their economy, right? So that's why they're never first, but they're never last either. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But like I said, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But more than likely, what would happen is we would see those shares trade on the OTC. They'd probably apply to the TSX. Obviously, if you're in the US, there's restrictions there with buying on Canadian exchanges, but you should be able to buy on the OTC. And like I said, you might have to transfer brokerages at that point, but we should be given tons of heads up, and then at that point you can consult with your tax professional or your financial advisor. All right, let me know what you think of this, and we'll continue the conversation in the comment section below. Once again, happy Friday. Hope you have a fantastic weekend ahead. It's Rod with Pow Group. Thanks again for joining us on the Pursuit of Wealth, and we'll catch you again on the next video.